Hi, everyone. I'm McKenna. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas. And I have to admit, we have been back to in-store events mostly. So I feel a little rusty in front of the camera tonight for this live stream. But thanks to everyone joining us. We have Hayley Scrivenor in conversation with Hannah Kent this evening. And I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. I think it's going to be a delight. And Hayley is, of course, here to talk about her brand new book that came out today, Dirt Creek. Let me go ahead and bring her on. But before I do that, if you're watching and you have any questions, don't be shy. You can put them in the comments on Facebook or in the live chat on YouTube, and we'll get to them in a little bit. So, Hayley, how are you this evening? Hi.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on your Tuesday evening and my Wednesday morning.
I was about to say
in the future.
You are in the future. Yes, it's nice to talk to you. And congratulations on the book. Like I said, we are fans, and I've already put a link in the comments in case anyone wants to order it. So for more information about this book, you, Hannah Kent, her books, it can all be right there at the link. So originally from a small country town in rural Australia, Hayley Scrivenor is a writer, teacher, and former director of Wollongong Writers Festival. Dirt Creek is her first novel. An earlier version of the book was shortlisted for the Penguin Literary Prize and won the Kill Your Darlings Unpublished Manuscript Award. Hayley lives and writes on Dharawal country on the south coast of New South Wales in Australia, and apologies for any of those pronunciations that were butchered.
No, you did well. You did well.
I asked about your name earlier, and I should have asked about those, but I think we got through it. We also have Hannah Kent joining us. Hi, Hannah. How are you?
Hi, McKenna. I'm really well, thanks. You?
I'm well, thanks. I'm so happy to have you here because it makes my life so easy to have a guest moderator. I always joke that they're my favorite people of the evening because you do make my life slightly easier. And I'm looking forward to sitting back and enjoying this chat. So let me do your bio as well really quickly, though. So Hannah Kent was born in Adelaide in 1985. Her first novel, Burial Rites, has been translated into nearly 30 languages and was shortlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, formerly the Orange Prize, and Guardian First Book Award and the International IMPAC Dublin Literary Award. Hannah is also the co-founder and publishing director of Australian literary journal Kill Your Darlings. She also wrote The Good People, her second novel, and her latest book is Devotion. Thanks again for being here. I'm going to duck out. For those of you watching, don't be shy with the questions. We'll get to them in a little bit. And whenever the two of you are ready, just call me back on. Have fun.
Thanks, McKenna.
Thanks, McKenna. Hayley, happy publication day for the US. How does it feel?
It feels so I'm still very blown away that a story that feels so incredibly Australian, actually, and that I never... I think you go very specific, and for me, it's a book set around the place where I grew up, and I just never imagined that it would reach US readers, to be completely honest with you. So it's very exciting.
Oh, it's an incredibly exciting day. Many, many congratulations. It's wonderful to see Australian stories moving overseas and bringing in all kinds of readers who perhaps aren't as familiar with, Australia, Australian towns, Australian language. It's wonderful to see it happen. I remember, I have a very clear memory actually of receiving a copy of your book. I was very fortunate to be an early reader, and I remember it came with a note which didn't really say much more than, you are going to love this book. And I remember I with that note like that, I had to start reading immediately, and I don't think I did anything for the rest of the day. Dirt Creek is an extraordinary accomplishment. And I remember I was probably about maybe 5 pages in when I had to stop and check that you were actually a debut writer, because the word that was coming to my mind is, this is masterful. This is masterful storytelling. How did this all happen? One of the things I love to hear about first is, where did Dirt Creek come from for you? How long have you been working on this book?
Well, yeah, if it's any consolation, it did take years. So I started a PhD at my local university in 2016, and I should explain. So Dirt Creek kind of sounds a bit negative. It sort of sounds like a place that's a bit down on its luck. But for me, the town that my story takes place in is called Durton, Durton, and the kids of the town call it Dirt Town, in that way that you kind of give nicknames to places that you know well. on the playground, but it sort of has spread to the whole town. And of course, if Durton becomes Dirt Town, then Durton Creek becomes Dirt Creek. And so it really did start with that place. So I mentioned I grew up in a small country town, and McKenna mentioned it in my bio. And I was really, when I sat down to write, the PhD, you have to write a novel in a certain amount of time, right? Mm. And I was very afraid of that, but I wanted that. I needed that external pressure. And I thought, okay, I'll have to figure out a book. But I actually started with a very different project that was going to be set in space, which I really shouldn't tell people because it's really embarrassing and shows that I don't really know what I'm doing. But I sat down to write a short story about the children of the town where I had lived coming home. And it was literally just because whenever I sort of reached for a detail, I could find one. I just remembered the different ways that people would come home. And then I realized, that these children were speaking together. They were sort of speaking as one, which is an unusual point of view in fiction, right? We're very used to people saying, I walk over there, or we say they walk over there if it's in third person. But to say we walk over there is actually quite complicated. It's like, are we all arm in arm? Like, are we really all going from one place to another at the exact same time with the exact same feelings about it? That's actually kind of interesting. And so I thought if they are speaking together, something must have happened. Something big has happened in the town that has made the children kind of look back and go, what were we doing that afternoon? How did we get home from school that day? And that's when the story of the missing girl, who's at the heart of my book, Esther Bianchi, kind of came to me in a bit of a bolt, in as much as I knew who she was. I knew that she had already died, and that's not a spoiler, that's in the first couple of pages. And I knew who had killed her. And that kind of set me on a very long journey, but at least I felt like I was in a place that I knew well, and that really helped. And I feel like I dealt with, I wanted to deal with the small town where I'd grown up. I think I didn't really want to write about it, and yet when I wrote about it, things seemed to happen. I seemed to be some heat or some energy. And so that just kind of kept me going long before I knew all of the other kind of ins and outs of the plot. It was this idea of, okay, there's this group of kids and there's a missing girl, and there's a kind of end point far off in the distance that I'm shooting for. Yeah.
It's the collective narration which you have in this novel is, I think, one of the things which makes it one of the most extraordinarily original crime novels, particularly if you're allowed me to call it as such. It's certainly here in Australia, certainly anything I've ever read. And I want to ask you more about that. But I wonder whether you might also introduce us to the other perspectives which you share in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
yeah, but you balance so many. There are so many voices in this book, and it is perfectly balanced. Who are the other people who form the main characters in this story?
So we have, aside from the chorus that I talked about, and I do think of them as a Greek chorus, eventually I realized I really wanted Esther to be seen from a number of different angles, right? And I thought, I always envisaged her kind of as the whole at the center of the book. So I thought, on a plot level, I'd started to figure out that there would be a boy who had seen Esther on the day she went missing, but couldn't tell police for his own reasons. And so that character, who had kind of always been in the order of events, I decided to make him a point of view character, Lewis, and he's probably who I feel for. My heart really goes out to Lewis. But the character most probably close to me, in that she's a chubby know-it-all who is always thinking about where her next snack is coming from, is Ronnie. So that's Esther's best friend, Veronica, who walks home with Esther that day until they split up, and then she never sees her best friend again. And Ronnie is someone who is very has her faults, but she is incredibly loving and incredibly taken with Esther, as I think many of us. Those friendships that you just kind of get swept up in, that change your life, really. And so Esther is someone that Ronnie loves so deeply, and because we know Esther is kind of already gone, Ronnie's point of view allows us to kind of see her in action and sort of love Esther through Ronnie. And then I thought, if we had this missing girl, I also wanted to hear from her mother. So Constance is in a really difficult position in the book. Her life is kind of falling apart. Not only is her daughter go missing, but almost everything she thought she knew about her life seems to be falling apart kind of around her. And then the very last character before I shut the door and said, no more point of view characters, I can't have any more points of view in this book, is Detective Sergeant Sarah Michaels, who is a cop from Sydney, who comes into this small country town. So it's 2001 when the main events of the story take place, and Sarah is openly gay, and kind of that really was, but that's, for me, it was important that wasn't the point of her character, but I think her experiences and everything that's happened to her up to the moment that she enters the town equips her to be the one to kind of figure out just what's happened and kind of unpick this really complex web of not just events in the present, but events in the past that have kind of led to what's happened to Esther. Yeah. And then I said, no more. And I don't recommend to first-time writers having 5 points of view, one of which is a collective of children, you know, because, but I do think that each voice is there to give us a different way to ultimately follow Esther and hopefully fall in love with Esther. I really wanted, you know, I think sometimes where crime can fall down is that I will forget who the person who died was. You know, I see their body at the beginning, and at the end of the story, you know, I've enjoyed the way the plot's been kind of progressed, but I don't necessarily have that feeling for that person afterwards. And I think that was a goal that I wanted us to miss Esther, and really feel that she was gone. Yeah.
I think it's something which you have accomplished incredibly well. That struck me too, reading Dirt Creek. I felt, you know, I think there are certain conventions which you can expect of crime fiction, especially when you know that someone is dead right from the outset, like it is in this book. And it can be easy to sort of start to think of them in quite an objective way. You know, this is the missing person, but the story remains with the people who, you know, are the police procedural, or the people who maybe are being a bit shady, or the red herrings. You start to get too involved in finding out what happened, and sometimes the humanity of that person can be lost, I think. And I found that this was certainly not the case with Dirt Creek. In fact, by the end of this book, I found myself in almost a state of grief because she has been shaped so much by these perspectives, which, as I said earlier, you balance so well. And I wanted to ask you, when you came to draft this book, was there a particular perspective that was dominating over the others? I mean, or did you start from the outset saying, no, I'm going to have lots, this is something that I'm going to set out to do? What was the process of fleshing out these various stories? Because there are many threads and they're all held in tension. The pace never slackens. Basically, I'm asking how you did it.
Well, the very first draft was 100,000 words of just the Greek chorus, which was unreadable. It was not good. But I think what it did is let me think about what I guess because the children kind of speak for the town in some way. And so writing and I guess putting these details down, and as a first-time writer, really just realizing that when I let myself stop and I didn't kind of follow what seemed to need to happen next, then everything kind of fell apart. Whereas if I went, okay, I'm just going to continue to write what's coming. And it wasn't until I had that full draft of the collective voice, and I went to my PhD supervisor at the time, Dr. Shady Cosgrove, who's an American writer living in Wollongong, where I live. And she just said, yeah, but I don't care. You know, these are beautiful descriptions, or these are interesting little details, but there's no kind of forward momentum through the story. And so when I mentioned those characters, you know, the different points of view, they're really kind of in the order that I introduced them into the story. And when I talk about shutting the door behind Sarah, it really was like, okay, I think I have enough ways for us to progress through this story. And one of the things I had to do is pretty much write the book, or understand at least everyone's journey through the book. And what happens as I write is I don't know my characters. Some writers are very blessed, I think, and their characters kind of show up full formed, whereas I have to put them in various situations and write through that. And often it's moving them through certain situations. I'll learn something about them, and I'll discard that scene, but I'll have learned something important about who they are, right? And so practically what I ended up doing was basically writing most of it from everyone's point of view. And then I don't value my own writing very, like, I'm very happy to throw away my own writing, which is lucky because I just have to produce a lot of it to kind of actually find some kind of through line or find the scenes that are going to move the story forward. And then the challenge I really set myself was, okay, we should follow the story from the point of view that is most compelling and most interesting at every time. So when you've got those 5 points of view, and there are some events in the book we actually see twice. So that I try not to do that too much, but sometimes we get to see the same event from someone else's point of view. But the idea is that we're always being moved kind of through to kind of an inevitable endpoint. That's the hope. I did want to sort of grab the reader by the scruff of the neck and pull them through the story. That was a goal that I set myself. And so that, involved a lot of cutting and a lot of, oh, great, I've got this whole sort of series of events from Sarah's point of view, for example, but actually I don't need Sarah here. It's much more interesting to see what Ronnie is doing at this moment. And, it's not an efficient process, but I work with a lot of writers and just friends, right? And I think that idea of the that sense of what rises and what kind of it's amazing, something that feels very disconnected from the story as a whole. Sometimes you can look around you and go, I need a reason for this thing to happen, and something you learned about a character in a scene you wrote a year ago will suddenly kind of make sense. And so it has made me very sort of fatalist or something. George Saunders talks about this idea of the story being this beautiful glass globe that you take and smash, right? And you're trying to pick the pieces and make them into a globe again. And it will never be the globe that it was in your mind, but that commitment to total chaos and then slowly imposing order while keeping some kind of memory of the end goal. I don't know. I think that is the work of writing for me. It feels very mystical. It doesn't feel like I don't feel very in control very often in writing, except for those late stage editing where you're kind of able to really turn certain levers very, very accurately to the left or right, because you've got wonderful editors helping you kind of and articulating back to you what the effect is,
I wonder sometimes whether it just comes up, especially from what it sounds like is your process, which just to produce so much material and only a sliver of that becomes the book, and then it is calibrated throughout the editorial process. But for someone who knows so much about all their characters and about the plot, you can lose that kind of objectivity that a reader will bring to a book. So it can be hard to sort of think of it as a cohesive whole, I imagine. I only say this because this is how I work. And I have a feeling that you're a complete by the seat of your pantser too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, aside from knowing who had killed Esther, which on paper is one of the things driving us through the story, but and I think people often describe my book as a slow burn, or sometimes it's called a police procedural, and I can understand why, but I also think that's only 1/5 of the story, So we've got Sarah, who is good at her job and is doing the work, and it was important to me that plot line be satisfying, but that is only her arc. Ronnie and Lewis and even the chorus of children, for me, it's very much a story about what happens when you take someone away, So I think it's as much an emotional kind of story as a whodunit, and I do think if you go into it expecting it to be, and I really enjoy those kinds of stories too, but I think I just, I get so distracted by these characters that I've kind of sat with for a long time, that they have equal weight as the ending for me. I want it as much to be an event of language and character than as, oh my God, yes, it's all come together in this final moment.
And there is such emphasis. What I found reading it was there is such a lyricism to your language and to the language in this book. And I actually think maybe you could read us a little bit, perhaps from this collective narration, because we talk about it, but I think it would be useful for people to get a sense of not only what it is and what it contributes to the story, what it brings, the sensibility and the atmosphere, but also just the quality of your writing, Hayley. It would be a treat. Could you read us a little bit?
Sure, I will just read a very short bit from the beginning, which I think gives us a sense of the flavour of certainly the choral narration. We were waiting for things to converge. It was still dark. Even if the sun had been up, we would not have needed to look around us. It was the same dirt, lazily punctuated here and there by dry grass, the same rust-ringed cement water trough close to the fence line, the same white cypress pines that dotted our own family's properties, a landscape as familiar to us as the backs of our own eyelids. And we knew we'd found the spot again by the smell. It pushed its way into our nose and throat like a rod of twisted tissue rammed so far it hurt. It was the smell of dead lambs left to rot in the sun. The stitches in the man's arm tugged as he turned the steering wheel of his ute. From his vantage point in the driver's seat, the main house was just a smudge in the distance. The sun was coming up now. He was checking the fences after his time away from the farm. If he'd driven just a metre closer to the fence line, a metre was nothing on a property like his, he never would have found it. But the ute's cab tipped slightly as he drove over soft ground. The man stood in the space created by the open front door of his vehicle, and the smell hit him the same way it had hit us. He walked around the ute and plucked a shovel from the cargo bed. Us kids heard and saw it all. The man's laboured breathing was interrupted only by the occasional shink of the shovel in soil. We watched his face as he winced in pain. We took note of the angle of his shoulders as the blade hit something that did not give, something that was not dirt or a root. We saw him crouch to scoop away earth with one hand, running his fingers along shiny black plastic. It was 4 days since anyone, including us, had seen Esther Bianchi.
Oh my goodness, Hayley. It's such an incredible opening to a novel. And like I said earlier, this was something that just hooked me. I mean, I completely neglected everything I had to do that day, and I just sat down and I read it. And I'm so excited for US readers to read it because it is so compelling. And yes, you're right. There is not just a focus on police procedure. It is not simply a whodunit. There is so much going on, but it is such a rich and completely enveloping experience to read it. One of the things that really interests me also about this narrative is, yes, we have the absence of Esther Bianchi at its centre, but I've heard you say before that you consider it a novel also about childhood and about the friendship between children. Can you speak to a little bit of that? Because I think you're absolutely right. There's something else here which is being explored.
Yeah, I think it, I mentioned that the book was a way for me to, that when I started writing about the town where I'd grown up, that seemed to have heat in it. And I think part of that was I left the town where I grew up when I was 12. And I don't think it's a coincidence that of the child characters in my book, they all kind of top out at 12. And then you've got two characters who are like outsiders to the town. So Constance has been living in the town for a while, Esther's mother, but she'll never be of the town in the same way that her husband is, who was born there. And then Sarah's obviously from Sydney, so from a big city. And so I think one thing that I think started out by working from the assumption that my understanding of childhood didn't really align with what I sometimes see in books and television and stuff, and enjoy, right? This idea of quite innocent, joyful childhood is obviously lovely. But I think as a child, I was quite an anxious child. And I think I felt all the big emotions that I feel now as an adult. I felt shame and fear and love and all these sort of big feelings. And, I think we often think of children's emotions as muted, or because what they do is not as important as adults, that they will somehow feel it less. And yet I think emotion is almost the same, and you grow around your emotions. You get older and you're more able to articulate what's going on. You're more able to like physically leave if something is not right or is wrong. And so I was really interested in what would happen if I took children really seriously. And in terms of Ronnie and Lewis, I've got two characters who both, I think, deal with fear and shame. And on one hand, you've got Ronnie, and her fears are things like being caught tracing, which was one of my secret fears, right? Like as a kid, I wanted people to think I was really good at drawing. And so, and I would and like looking back, it was so obvious. It was like when I would tell people that my mum could drive a tank or something. Like it would have been so obvious that I once actually told people that my mum was on Jerry Springer, because I thought that was like the coolest thing that could possibly happen to someone.
Social currency.
And that's the flip side of a child's voice too, is that you're often, so that shame is real and I'm taking it seriously. But as the reader, you also, that idea, like as a kid, you're like, wow, other people's houses smell weird, but not my house. Only other people's houses smell weird, because you don't. And as the reader, you would read something like that and go, oh, of course, like that's what a child thinks. They don't understand that, of course, their house would smell weird to other people. And so I also enjoy those little moments of humor or insight that the reader can have, which is interesting in the context of a book that's more of a mystery, because you're also dealing, I don't think either of my children are unreliable at all in that they believe what they're saying. But of course, sometimes you can read more deeply into kind of what they're saying. And so, yeah, I think I just started from this position of what happens if I take children very seriously. And because of that, I guess they're both very implicated in the plot in ways that I think every character should be, right? And I think, but also who they are totally dictates the kind of things they do, which is how it should, I think, work with character. And it sounds maybe like almost too obvious, but I think that time spent taking them seriously helped me almost what, like I was saying before, there would be something that needed to happen and I would realize, oh, this is what Ronnie would do because this is how she feels about this thing. And I've kind of invested a lot of time and energy in that. So I took all my characters sort of equally seriously, I think. And in a way, Ronnie was the easiest character to write. And it was almost like a high watermark of interiority and kind of her actions and her thoughts, you know, being in alignment, but also surprising, right? I think a character should surprise you. So that once I felt like I had that high watermark, it was then bringing everyone else to that level. I don't know if you ever feel that way about writing. Like sometimes it's a sentence or a paragraph, you go, okay, that's the high watermark that I want everything else to rise to, and I have no idea how I'm going to do it yet. But that's it, you know, and once you have that moment, that's useful. Once you have that sort of sense of like, okay, that's the mark that I'm shooting for. Yeah. So it was useful and started with children for me, I think. Yeah.
There is such emotional honesty, I think, in the way in which you have portrayed these children and you inhabit their perspectives. And you know, people talk often about the innocence of a child, and I think that can be a little bit two-dimensional. And I think what you have here in a book, which is, you know, has a lot of violence in it in very subtle ways half of the time, is that you have children who are aware of it going on. They're not they don't have the wool pulled down of their eyes. They have real anxieties. They have real processes of grief as well, but they also have, you know, a certain lightness, I think, which throws, I guess, the experience of the adult, especially certainly the adult perspectives and the many adult characters around them into sort of a new context. I think it shows a different way of experiencing the same things which are happening in the town. And I wanted to ask you about this because, you know, we have this very public disappearance of Esther at the heart of the book, but all around it, sometimes alluded to by Lewis, sometimes by Ronnie, sometimes unseen by them, but often they are witness to a lot of this. We have a lot of small hidden acts of erasure and cruelty, and there is suffering too within this town. And I wondered whether, and it seems to me by the time that I finished reading the novel, I felt that the book was as much a commentary of the ways in which these things are hidden and yet exist, you know, almost uniformly, whether it's a small country town or not, within small communities, particularly though. And I wondered whether this was something which snuck in organically through your process of writing about the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl, or whether this was something that you wish to comment on from the outside, that you were interested in looking at the ways in which people live with, I guess, a lot of private suffering.
Yeah, it's interesting because I definitely wouldn't say that I set out to write about violence at all, and which almost sounds silly when I, you know, read my own book back and I go, wow, there really is. There's these kinds of, I guess, this idea of once you spend time with someone, and you know, in my case, they're imaginary friends, right? Like and that's part of the tension of being a writer. You realize you've kind of done it to yourself, and it can seem disingenuous to say, oh, this violence just showed up. It's not like I wanted to inflict this on the reader, but I certainly didn't start out from a position of wanting to explore violence. And I wrote the scenes, and I would often I try and take away as much as humanly possible. And so I completely understand why someone wouldn't want to read my book, because there are mentions of sexual assault and there is domestic violence. But I try to honor the experience of that character while also, I guess, keeping the reader in mind. And I think there's things you can do to sort of pay the right amount of respect to that experience, or give it the gravity it maybe deserves, without forcing the reader to sit with it for too long. And that's not just violence. That's things like, for example, Esther's mother. She's in this horrible position where her daughter's just not there. And as a character, you know, anyone who's ever had someone they love not be where they're supposed to be, you know that 5 minutes is excruciating. And so every time we come back to Constance, it's almost we're dropping back into that timeline of, oh, it's been 5 hours, or it's been 10 hours, or it's been 24 hours. And so I try and balance. One of the benefits of having so many points of view is that you can kind of get a sense of when the reader might have had too much and pull back or pull to a different point of view. But I think what happens when you take people seriously, take your characters seriously, is you realize everyone's got their own kind of constellation of experiences that they're carrying around with them. And not just in small country towns, but certainly in the small country town where I grew up, I think violence is a feature of that. And it's not that I think violence is just a handy way to explain away how people act, because I don't believe that previous violence excuses kind of certain behavior. But I think it certainly helps make the characters in my book make a bit more sense in their kind of context. And so it really wasn't something I set out to do. It just very much was something that seemed to be there. And I think the most notable is, in many ways, is Lewis. And I said he's sort of my heartbreaker. He's the character that I still like to think about, what he's up to, because, and I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say he goes through some pretty horrific things, in violence in his home, but it was very important to me that he got some kind of happy ending. He's the character who kind of gets a white wedding. He marries the man that he loves. And you're never sure how long to make an ending, and you don't want to get that wrong. But this thought of that we get some sense of where the characters have landed afterwards, I think also does some justice to what they survive. And I'm as much interested in what we survive and what we endure and how we show up for each other as I am in those more kind of violent, moments. And I think we think of conflict as the vehicle for story, but you can't have conflict. Kath McKinnon, a writer I really admire, said that there is no conflict without connection first. So if you don't care about the people and their connections to each other, then conflict will kind of just kind of wash off you. You won't. So I think I tried to measure the level of conflict that's in the book against the measure of understanding and connection that we have with the characters. And that's obviously for readers to decide. And I really don't hold it against anyone who maybe feels that they don't want to sit with that. But I try and keep the reader in mind all through that process.
Yeah, look, I think it ought to be said that this is a novel as much about connection and about community and a coming together as it is about those points where people splinter apart and the hostilities that arise. Let's talk about LGBTQIA representation in Dirt Creek. It's so wonderful to have queer representation. Again, was this something which occurred to you to deliberately represent? Was this something that you were interested in exploring, queer identity, or was it something which, again, seemed to arise very organically through that sort of, the pantsing of the draft process?
I do think, as opposed to violence, there was something about it did feel much more ingrained from the start, particularly with Lewis, because I always knew that there would be some part of the plot would arise from the fact that he knows something about himself that he knows would not be welcome in the town. And going back to this idea of like, in a way, you have to make a novel work for you. You're not going to be able to sit with it for years if it's not doing something that you kind of need from it. Not in a transactional sense, but I think I knew in my small country town that there was something about me that I didn't have language for yet. And yet I was very clear that would not be welcome. It was sort of, I didn't have the word queer, but I knew that these kind of feelings would not find a kind of warm and safe and happy landing. And we're talking 2001. And when I say, Ronnie and Lewis are 12 and 11 in 2001, and I was 12 in 2001. So it felt like I couldn't not write about that. And I think boys' experiences of homophobia are certainly can be different to girls. And I think there is a kind of pointed, and I guess I think homophobia directed towards men and boys in small towns I saw play out in equally damaging ways, but ways that are perhaps more physically violent. And that's kind of reflected in the book. That's what you understand what Lewis is kind of up against pretty quickly, and you can understand why he's scared to come forward. He's not wrong about the assumptions that he's making about the people around him. And so I guess I'm interested in the families that, are they your family if they don't love you for who you really are? I think that question really interested me, and I think it was always going to kind of come out in the writing. But then I had a Sarah came along as a character, and I think was a nice counterpoint in that in the town of Durton, she is in charge. You know, she's the detective sergeant in charge of the case, and she's working with Detective Constable Wayne Smith, who is, they've worked together before, and he backs her. He respects her judgment. They have a fairly jokey dynamic sometimes, but ultimately he defers to her better judgment. You know, and so in that space of Durton, she gets to just be competent and do her job, which may not be true for a gay female detective sergeant in 2001 in New South Wales Police Force everywhere that she operates. But in the story that I'm telling, where she's one strand, what I enjoyed too was that this is just part of who she is. And as I said, her experiences kind of prime her ultimately to be the one to understand what people are kind of capable of. And I did like that there's almost, while showing Lewis and kind of hopefully honouring that experience and the difficulty of that, I show some version of the future where that is no longer the case. And there's tension, you know, in that, you know, it's not, you know, going back to this idea of Sarah has her own things kind of going on, and one of them is breaking up with someone that she loved, who happens to be a Syrian drag king who works in Sydney, you know, but it's sort of, I did enjoy having those kind of 2 points and those two ways of looking at the same idea. And, you know, that idea of that it does get better, I think, was important. And again, that goes back to having Lewis have something of a happy ending, something recognizable as a happy ending was really important to me. Yeah. But I think it was baked in. It was baked in fairly early, I think.
I thought that having the two various representations of a queer experience was incredibly powerful, and I think they did sort of speak to each other, even though there wasn't necessarily sort of a crossroads between them. And I thought that was a really clever way of exploring, I guess, the various experiences of the queer community, and also at the same time offering hope for Lewis, you know, explicitly at some times, but also indirectly through Sarah's own experiences. As some of your readers might be aware, the last 5 years in Australia seems to have just been a boom time for, I don't know, what people sometimes refer to as outback noir or just Australian crime. It's often being held up as sort of in comparison to the boom that we had of Nordic noir. Do you see yourself as a writer of outback noir? And if so, what interests you? I think there seems to be a specific or a particular amount of books which have been published in recent years which do take as their focus the small town, you know. What interests you about small towns, other from the fact that, as you've said, you have come from one, but what do you think maybe also interests readers about exploring the small Australian town? What can they offer for a writer, and what do they interest the reader in?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I would not say that I was at all crime literate. I didn't read a lot of crime. And I distinctly remember being about 3 or 4 years into writing my book, and someone was like, "Oh, have you heard of this book called The Dry?" And I was like, "Oh, no." And they lent it to me, and I remember reading it and going, "Oh, no," you know, "Oh, no." And then, which I think every writer has had that moment of like, oh, this thing that I thought I was exploring, or this place, and then of course you kind of, you have a big glass of water and you go, all right, we're all able to explore spaces that interest us for whatever reason. And I know as a reader why the small town works so well. It's kind of this idea of physical isolation can feed into things that make a story compelling, you know. You take it immediately suggests that things that are happening in the present tense are happening over a past that's probably had something happen in it as well, because people are living in the same spaces and going over the same places. And I don't want to sound sort of disingenuous at all, but it really was a place that I needed to write about, and that I, you know, and I don't mind people saying, oh, you've caught this wave of like outback noir or rural noir, which is really hard to say, like rural noir. And so did you say the rural juror? Yeah, I was thinking of that. I always think of that too from 30 Rock. But ultimately it was more of a surprise. Like if I was on the wave, it was like I did not realize I was on the wave until I woke up in my armchair, really. So I'm not complaining that, you know, I owe a great debt to writers like Jane Harper. Even the fact that in the bit I read, I used the word ute, which is a utility vehicle, which is, you know, this idea of a car that has a tray at the back. And they sort of said,
the US,
yeah, we would normally change that to truck, but Jane Harper got to keep her ute, so we're going to let you keep your utes. And as an Australian, it would sound so wrong to say he got in his truck, because for us, a truck is a much bigger kind of vehicle. And so things like that, I think writers like Jane Harper, who convinced, before I got there, Australia, that, you know, particularly American readers, for example, that Australian crime or place, you know, small town Australia could be an interesting place. I owe her a debt, certainly. But I think I was writing the story that I needed to write, which is what I think every writer should do. I think if you try and time getting on that wave, like it, yeah. And my next book, I think, will explore a different kind of small community, but it won't be a dry, small country town, because I feel like I've worked through that. And I might come back to it one day, but it's certainly not in the same way I don't feel the need to write from a child's perspective, because I spent so much time doing that and thinking about that. And I feel as satisfied as you can ever be with a book. Like I still pick it up and go, oh, maybe I could change, you know, this. But I do feel like I've kind of dealt with those things enough that I can move on and find heat in something else. Yeah,
absolutely.
But I enjoy. It's lovely to reach readers who are kind of primed to find the place you're writing about interesting. I'm lucky on that level. Yeah.
Oh, look, as you say, I think it's something that's a little bit serendipitous. There's a little bit of synchronicity happening there, but how wonderful too that this means that now we can retain the very Australian references to utes and so forth. It's nice to spread the Australian lexicon throughout the world. I think we probably now have some time for some questions. If some of you have been writing in, or
speak of the devil, there's McKenna.
We have been having nice viewership, and everyone is quiet. I don't know if they've been enthralled with your chat or what's happening, but there are no questions. I will say, as a comment to the Jane Harper discussion that just took place, that as a bookseller, it is very easy to have people come in and us be able to say, did you love Jane Harper's The Dry? You should read this. So it's not the worst thing in the world, the similarity, because you were definitely correct that she has opened the door to some audiences. And obviously there were other Australian crime authors before that, but the level that The Dry reached did, you know, perhaps open some more doors. So we certainly don't have any problem with it. It makes it easier for us to sell the book. Oh, someone just popped in. I have a question. Okay, Trisha, what's the question? So we're going to wait here for her. Before we get to that, I would like to ask Hannah to tell us about either the book she's working on or the one that just came out, or whatever you'd like to tell us about, because we so appreciated you coming and moderating this event.
Oh, no, it's been such a pleasure. I've been such an admirer of Hayley's from afar. It's a real treat to be able to have a chat. Thank you, McKenna. I published a book late last year called Devotion, which is now out in Australia and the UK and in Europe, but I'm not yet in North America, I don't think, but it can be ordered from online. And Devotion is also set mostly in South Australia. It tells the story of a group of Prussian immigrants, old Lutherans, who migrate over to the colony. But at its heart is a queer love story, as we were talking about queer representation, of these two young women who belong to this fairly religious congregation. But it is also in many ways, I guess, just I don't know, there's such a joy. We were talking about it before, Hayley. There's such a joy of being able to write about the places where we grow up. And I think that's also true for this book for me. It was very much a love letter to the beautiful surrounds on Paramount Country where I grew up.
And I just have to say, it's a book, Devotion is a book that I regularly bought for friends, particularly writer friends, particularly at the time when they are struggling to, what I think of as hold their nerve. You know, Devotion is a book that is so astonishing in its kind of execution and its sort of form, aside from the beautiful writing and the, you know, this grounding in place and these characters that I still think about your characters, Hannah, years later. You know, your first two books, those characters still live in my head. But what Devotion does is such an event of literature. I think it belongs in the canon of great Australian books. And, it's to the detriment of North America that you can't walk into a bookstore and buy it. So, but you can. Here in Australia, we're quite used to sourcing books that we may not get in shops. So if there's one book you're going to do that for, then I would definitely recommend Devotion, because it is a beautiful, beautiful love story that I'm still thinking about. Lives in my head rent free.
That is so lovely of you. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have the question. So Trisha was wondering, here I can actually pop this on the screen. What inspires you for a story? A strong character, a strong sense of place? And I'll let both of you answer that, but why don't we start with Hayley?
Well, as I feel like I may have banged on about a bit now, this sense of place was important. But what I think I like is when character and place are kind of activating each other. So I think, going back to what we were just saying about a small town being a good setting because there are layers of things happening. I think anytime anyone walks into a room, everything that's ever happened to them in that room and the things they're thinking that might happen to them in that room, the possibilities of that room, what that room denies them, is kind of all there. And so I think when you start with a place, well, that's helpful. It kind of gets you moving. But when the story really starts to happen is when I think about not just the place in isolation, but the place as it is acting upon and being acted upon by the characters, And so, like I said, that process for me is very back and forth. So I'll write a bit of a setting and then think about, okay, what would the characters be doing there? But that movement back and forth, I think, does help you get the kind of settings and the kind of characters that you want. So that's how I think about it.
How about you, Hannah?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Hayley, I think. I write historical fiction, and I tend to focus on characters who belong to sort of, a working class, a labouring class. And so the relationship to the natural world, to the landscape, to the weather is a very keen one. It directly influences the shape of their days and also in many ways the trajectory of their lives. My first book was set in Iceland, and here you have an incredibly, sometimes very inhospitable environment, and naturally that's going to bring out certain qualities in the characters. You're going to have a certain stoicism. You're going to perhaps have a different relationship to the natural world because it is so hostile than you would say for my characters in my second book, which was set in Ireland, where this landscape becomes a place of kind of heady folklore. So yeah, I think it's not something, I don't think these are things that can be isolated out from one another. I think so much of writing about landscape is also writing character. They're very much, there is a very living, vibrant, changing relationship between the two.
Yeah. Okay, well, we don't have any other questions, and I think you two had such a lovely chat and covered so much. I think we've done it. Congrats again to you, Hayley, on Pub Day for Dirt Creek. We're very excited and wish you all the best. Thank you so much for joining us, Hannah. It has been a lovely chat to sit and listen to, and I guess happy Wednesday to both of you. So as it's evening, I'm going to go pour myself a glass of wine and sign off for the night. But thanks to everyone watching. Thanks to both of you. Have a great day. And I'm going to go ahead and end this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And thanks again so much to Hannah for reading the book. And it's just so lovely talking to someone who has considered it in the way you have. So it's very special. So thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for the privilege of your beautiful words.
All right. Good night, everyone. Bye.